Imposed on it right now. This is more or less an up-to-date plan of the A3 late 9th century level, which was destroyed in the late 9th century. Yes. Now, wherever we excavate it, we find these very impressive remains. And here you can see, I'm just going to zip through various finds, and you can see how they're very well preserved. Complete vessels, hundreds and hundreds of vessels, just about every type of object you can imagine, from every spectrum, every part of the spectrum of daily life, cultic vessels, and also I would call microscopic things. And one of the interesting things, which was mentioned already, I have the honor to co-direct the Bar-Ilan University Weizmann Institute of Science joint program in archaeological science, and through a wide spectrum of fields in archaeological science, we can study both the macro, but particularly the micro perspective on the finds from this and other strata. And for example, here's just a couple of perspectives that we get from in the field, whether it's through flotation, a very interesting object which turns out was used for production of wine, and as you know, the Philistines liked wine. Or just recently, we excavated in the last couple of weeks a building from this destruction, and once we start going down, we can see collapsed roofing, and here you can see the negative imprints of the reeds that were used for the roofing, signs of burning, which through a spectroscopic analysis we can tell which parts of the houses were burnt and which are not, fallen bricks and how they fell, objects in situ. You can see here a smiling volunteer excavating one, and other perspectives. Another thing that we can see here in this destruction are evidence of both the cult, but also the people who lived at the site. And in the excavation of one of the houses, we found remains of 4 or 5 skeletons of people who had been killed in the destruction. And very interestingly, these people were not buried in the destruction on the day of the conquest of the city. It turns out that these people were laying in the open air for years and possibly decades, enough time for the flesh to decompose and the bones to start to go through processes which can only happen when they're open to the air. And it seems that we have nice evidence with this and with other things of a very interesting phase of abandonment of the site, that the entire site was abandoned for perhaps decades after the destruction of the site, the conquest and the destruction of site by Hazael. At the same time, we have various evidence of cult, both in objects, but here and there in loci which seem to be specifically oriented to cult. And this very interesting building, which has at its corner plastered niches, and what seems to be a square or rectangular offering table. And on this offering table, we found a group of cultic objects, which, when excavated, turned out to include a very interesting combination of a pomegranate, a ring kernos, several of these, what I believe are phallic-shaped objects, and a couple of other things. And these objects were probably hanging from sort of mobile above this rectangular piece. Now, very interestingly, this room was the only room in this entire area of the excavation which was found empty. There weren't finds in it. Now, I hesitate to call this a temple because we don't have enough evidence, but I would say to give it a 100% sure identification, but there are very interesting aspects of this thing. Now, and of course, some of you may be familiar with my crazy idea about these things, and if you want to read about it, look at the article. Another interesting thing in this excavation of this level is the discovery of a bone tool workshop, something which, even though very mundane, turns out to be something that was hardly known in any other excavation in the ancient Near East. Now, when we first started doing our survey of the site, and as I said, we noticed that the 9th century pottery was predominant throughout the entire site, and it extended over an area of close to 500 dunam. And when we first published this suggestion that the site in the late 9th century was close to 500 dunam, some of the reactions of my dear colleagues was rather skeptical. And nothing like a challenge. So to prove that we can actually see remains of the size of the city, we opened up an excavation in the area of the lower city. This is the area of the upper city, which up until our excavations and survey was thought to be the extent of this site. And what we did is we simply extended it to the north of the city, between the Tel itself and the Elah River bed over here. And in area D, right at the beginning of excavation, we can see here the relationship to the upper city, to the Elah River bed. We have a fortification line which is on surface, and then right below surface we can see impressive remains of architecture, and again, right below surface we come to this same destruction layer, again with the scores and scores of vessels in situ, again representing this late 9th century destruction level. Now, who caused the destruction? And I've already given you the hint. Based on our ceramic dating of this phase, we can say it's somewhere in the second half of the 9th century. The carbon-14 dating, which now we have several dates from several different laboratories, now seems to point to the second half, but an early part of the second half of the 9th century BCE. It can be matched up with destructions at other sites which seem to be contemporary, such as at Tel Zayit. And as we will pull this together, I think it can be connected with the various historical evidence that we have of the central role of Hazael and the Assyrian withdrawal from southern Syria in the second half of the 9th century. And of course, basically all we know about the campaign of Hazael to the south, to Philistia, is from the biblical text. Now in 2 Kings 12:18 in the Hebrew, we have half of a passage which before the passage goes on to discuss Hazael's campaign to Jerusalem. It's mentioned very briefly that he fought against Gat and took it. For many years there was a discussion which Gat this was. I think now, with the very, very convincing evidence, we can say now that this is the Gat that was captured. An interesting sidebar is in the one of the versions of the Targum Shivim, of the Septuagint, there's a mention of a slightly different version, that there was a campaign to Philistia, and Hazael took the area up to Afek. And it's not clear what that source helps us, or what's this reliability. But the bottom line is, all this evidence points to identification of this destruction to Hazael, king of Aram Damascus. Now we have some very interesting additional evidence of the site. Based on the aerial photograph of the site, at the very, very beginning of the project, we noticed this very interesting feature, which I marked off here in yellow lines, which surrounds the site on the eastern, southern, and western side. And here you can see it marked off in the plan as well. And it was clear immediately that this was a siege system. And for the last 10 or so years, we've been excavating and surveying this, and now we have a clear picture of what we have here. This is a trench. And here you can see the trench, part of it excavated, and the material that was poured out of the trench, always on the side away from the city. And if you look inside the trench, you can see it's dug out in bedrock, or rather quarried out in bedrock, about 8 meters wide on the top, about 4 at the bottom,